Welcome to Soundscape Books. You're listening to an exclusive audiobook recording of The Monster Across the Street, a psychological thriller by Vivienne Black. Like and subscribe for more content.
Chapter 1. A Quiet Texas Summer. The Texas summer hummed, a thick, golden warmth Hazel knew intimately. It seeped into the soles of her bare feet on sun-baked asphalt, lingered on her tongue with the sticky sweet juice of a watermelon slice. This was the season of endless days, a time for perilous quests. She navigated the backyard's treacherous jungles, a verdant expanse where every blade of grass was a towering tree, the garden hose a coiled, venomous python. Towering oaks cast sun-dappled shadows that shifted like watchful eyes. Her whispered commands to Sir Reginald, her invisible companion, were barely audible over the cicadas' insistent chorus. Hazel, red pigtails flying, imagined herself a fearless explorer, though the tall grass already prickled her knees. A rogue gust of wind sent a shower of pecan leaves tumbling. She dodged them with a clumsy skip, her bright red sneakers a blur, a fleeting flash against the green. She wondered if Sir Reginald, too, felt the tickle of the wild. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised peach and lavender, the rich aroma of Sarah's homemade lasagna, bubbling with cheese and herbs, began to waft from the kitchen. Inside, the evening ritual was in full swing. The comforting clatter of forks against plates, the murmur of easy conversation. "Eat your broccoli, Parker," Hazel declared, pushing her own untouched florets around her plate. "It makes you strong for fighting dragons." Parker, Hazel's older brother, didn't look up. He was busy poking at his peas, arranging them into a tiny green fortress. Their father, James, listened, a slight crick in his neck from a long day, offering a gentle question now and then. A deep contentment settled over James, a quiet, almost domestic pride in the vibrant world he and Sarah had carefully built. He leaned back, the dining chair groaning a soft protest. He wondered, idly, if his office chair was nearing the same fate. After the dinner plates had been cleared and the last echoes of laughter faded, James retreated to his small home office. The air here was thick with the scent of old paper and the soft glow of his desk lamp. He settled into his worn leather chair, the familiar material groaning a little under his weight, a sound that marked the day's domestic peace slowly giving way to the quiet hum of his laptop. Shelves crammed with legal tomes and frames degrees stood testament to years of dedicated, often thankless work. His fingers moved across the keyboard with focused intent, scrolling through news feeds and legal forums. There were always faint anxieties, distant murmurings from beyond their small town's borders, stories of injustices and societal cracks he, as a human rights attorney, felt compelled to monitor, even when they seemed far removed. He paused on a headline, a local politician's controversial speech on immigration. It was a brief, unsettling blip in the usual flow of local news, but it stirred up old, familiar fears. He rubbed his temples, a dull throb beginning to pulse behind his eyes. The next morning, the summer sun was already climbing high when Hazel and Parker settled onto their front porch, a prime vantage point for observing the curious world around them. Their gaze, as always, drifted across the street to the old house. It stood apart, its paint peeling, its lawn a wild tangle of weeds and resilient wildflowers. This was River's house, home to the quiet veteran who rarely emerged, a figure shrouded in hushed adult whispers and the children's own vivid imaginings. "He's probably just a grumpy old man," Parker muttered, kicking absently at a loose floorboard. "Mom says to leave him alone." Hazel turned to him, her red pigtail swaying. "Did she say why?" she pressed, though she already knew the unspoken answer. She saw the deep shadows that clung to the windows, the way the porch swing creaked even when there was no breeze. Her mind, full of stories and half-remembered fairy tales, painted River not just as an old man, but as a mysterious, possibly dangerous figure. They watched for a long moment, catching only the faintest flicker of movement behind a curtain. The air was growing heavy, promising a thunderstorm later. As they finally turned to go inside, a small, smooth river stone, cool and gray, lay on the edge of their mailbox. Hazel picked it up, her brow furrowed, a mix of wonder and a strange, lingering unease. She wondered if it was a magic stone. That evening, the air conditioner whirred a steady rhythm, a cool counterpoint to the Texas heat. The family gathered in the living room, the television a low murmur in the background. "Anything interesting happened today?" Sarah asked, not looking up from her phone. "Just the usual," James replied, his eyes still on the screen, a weariness he hadn't quite shed clinging to his shoulders. He was flipping through channels, searching for a local baseball game, when the screen suddenly flashed, interrupting a cooking show with a breaking news alert. The local anchor, usually so jovial, wore a somber expression. She reported on an alleged assault. Details followed. Ava Sterling, daughter of prominent local businessman Frank Sterling, found injured near the town square. James leaned forward, his casual demeanor replaced by a professional alertness. A chill, sharp, and unwelcome settled in his gut. This was it, the kind of case that didn't just tear at individuals, but ripped through the fabric of a community. "This is bad," he murmured, almost to himself, his gaze fixed on the screen. The anchor continued, her voice grave. An image flashed onto the screen, a young man's face, dark-haired, with wide, uncertain eyes. "The suspect," she announced, "is Noah, a Syrian refugee recently arrived in our quiet town, working as a courier." A sudden silence fell over the room, broken only by the steady whirring of the AC. James felt a grim recognition, a chill that went deeper than the conditioned air. He knew this pattern. His gaze sharpened, jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as the implications settled over him, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't just local news. It was a spark, capable of igniting a volatile mix of fear and judgment. The town, already simmering with underlying tensions about new arrivals, felt poised on a precipice. He could already feel the invisible threads of suspicion tightening around their small community, a premonition of the storm to come. The faint pressure behind his eyes, a remnant of his long day, intensified into a sharp, undeniable certainty. His quiet, domestic world, so carefully constructed, was about to collide with the very injustices he spent his life fighting. The familiar weight of such battles settled on him, but this time it carried a new, personal edge. He knew what would be required of him, the difficult calls, the sleepless nights, the way it would inevitably ripple through the carefully guarded peace of his home. And as the screen faded to a commercial, he felt the cold, hard knot of an unwelcome decision already tightening in his stomach. Chapter 2. The Storm Gathers. The uneasy certainty James had felt the night before had congealed, a cold, hard knot tightening in his stomach as he sat in his office chair. Morning light, usually a soft invitation, felt like a harsh interrogation. It streamed through the blinds of his home office, illuminating dust motes that danced in the unforgiving glare. Untouched stacks of legal briefs lay on his desk, stark against the brightness. The sun, typically a comforting presence, now felt sharp and intrusive. He picked up the phone, the plastic cool beneath his fingers. He took a sip of his now cold coffee, the bitter taste doing little to ground him. For a long moment, he stared at the number, the immense weight of his decision pressing down, a heavy stone settling deep in his gut. This call, he knew, would send ripples, not just through his career, but through the quiet fabric of his family's life. Just yesterday, a colleague's warning, thinly disguised as concern, had echoed in his mind. This isn't just about the law, James. This is about perception, about a town that doesn't like outsiders, especially when they're accused of that. James had seen the initial reports, though. He'd spotted the subtle, undeniable undertones of prejudice woven into the narrative, the way Noah's refugee status was emphasized over any actual evidence. He remembered the smell of old paper and dust in the archives, where he'd first learned to question every line, every unspoken assumption. His moral compass, honed over years of fighting for the marginalized, pointed him in one direction, unwavering. Still, a flicker of doubt, cold and quick, tried to assert itself. He pictured Hazel's earnest face, Parker's boisterous laugh. He imagined the quiet disapproval of his neighbors, the knowing glances. Was he being reckless? Was his conviction worth this cost? He closed his eyes, picturing the file again, the young man's frightened eyes in a blurry photo. The injustice was clear. With a deep breath, he dialed. The click of the buttons sounded unnervingly loud in the quiet room, a series of small, irreversible declarations. By lunchtime, the news of James's decision had spread like wildfire through the small town. Whispers followed him from the courthouse to the local diner, eyes lingering a moment too long, then darting away. But it was the digital world where the true storm erupted. His phone, usually a tool for legal research, became a relentless stream of hate. Comments flooded local news sites and community forums. Refugee lover, traitor to our own. He's defending a monster. The town's simmering xenophobia, a low heat beneath the surface, now boiled over. It targeted not just Noah, but James and his family. A cold dread seeped into his chest as he scrolled through the vitriol, the words blurring into an ugly tide. He rubbed his temples, picturing Hazel and Parker, unknowingly caught in the sudden, ugly crossfire. The silence in his office felt thick, pressing down, heavy with unspoken threats. That evening, the usual comfortable rhythm of their family dinner was fractured. The clinking of forks against plates, the low hum of conversation, all felt strained, like a melody played slightly off-key. James tried to maintain some normalcy, asking Hazel about her day at school, Parker about his basketball practice. Hazel, ever sensitive, picked up on the tension in her parents' hushed tones, the way her mother kept glancing at James, her brow furrowed with a worry Hazel couldn't quite name. She traced a faint, old jam stain on the tablecloth, the familiar pattern a small comfort in the shifting air. Outside, a chill wind rattled the windows, adding its own note of unease to the room. Then, the local news anchor's voice cut through the forced calm. It emanated from the television in the living room, a low hum James usually ignored, but tonight it felt like a siren. Controversial decision by local attorney James Miller to represent Syrian refugee Noah al-Hamad in the assault case against Ava Sterling. Parker's fork clattered against his plate, the sound sharp in the sudden quiet. "Dad, what's going on? Why are people saying those things online?" "It's just, people don't understand, son. I'm doing my job," James said, his voice a little too loud, too firm. But Hazel saw the flicker of fear in his eyes, the way his jaw was tight. The world, which had always felt so safe and predictable, suddenly felt like it was shifting beneath her feet, a slow, sickening lurch. The jam stain on the tablecloth blurred. The next day at school, the whispers weren't just background noise. They were aimed. Friends who usually greeted Hazel with hugs averted their eyes, clutching their backpacks tighter as she passed. Her own hands felt cold, clammy. In the cafeteria, she heard her name, then refugee lover's kid, followed by hushed giggles. A knot formed in her stomach, a hot, tight confusion. She didn't understand why. Why were her friends suddenly looking at her like she was different, like she was bad? The feeling intensified, a prickle of unease, like ants crawling under her skin. She stared at her untouched sandwich, the crusts curling. Later that day, the whispers escalated into a direct confrontation in the schoolyard. Hazel was walking past the basketball courts, trying to find a quiet corner, when she saw Parker. He was surrounded by a group of older boys. One of them, a hulking kid named Mark, stepped forward, his face twisted into a sneer. "Look, it's the refugee lover. Your dad thinks that terrorist is innocent, huh?" Parker's face flushed crimson. "Leave my dad out of this, Mark," he shouted back, his voice trembling, a little crack in it. "You don't know anything." Mark laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Oh, we know enough. Your dad's a freak, just like that sand rat he's defending." Parker lunged forward, a raw, protective fury blazing in his eyes. But his friends held him back, their grip tight on his arms. Hazel froze, leaving the lingering scent of fear and stale sweat in the air. As dusk settled, casting long shadows across the street, River stood by his living room window, a cup of lukewarm coffee in his hand. He watched James's house, the warm glow of its interior lights a stark contrast to the growing darkness outside. The thought of dinner felt like too much effort, a burden he wasn't ready to shoulder. His gaze lingered on the children's bedroom windows, a familiar, unsettling tension tightening in his chest. He shifted his weight, the lukewarm coffee doing little to warm him. The world was a dangerous place, he thought. But the true battles weren't always fought with fists or shouted words. Sometimes they were waged in quiet rooms with smooth voices and sharp papers, against forces so entrenched they seemed invisible, until they began to grind everything you held dear into dust. Chapter 3: The Weight of Accusation. The conference room air hung stale, faintly perfumed with old coffee, and thick with unspoken accusations. Each glance from Sterling's legal team pressed down on James like a physical weight. The atmosphere crackled with a silent, predatory energy. Their lead counsel, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, leaned back, radiating an arrogant confidence that grated on James's nerves. A cold knot of frustration tightened in James's gut. This initial meeting with the district attorney and Sterling's lawyers had felt less like a negotiation and more like a declaration of war. "Mr. Miller, our client is prepared to offer a settlement," the counsel began, his voice smooth as oil, "provided your client admits full culpability and withdraws his asylum application immediately." James pushed his preliminary findings across the polished table. The inconsistencies he'd already spotted were highlighted in red, a testament to his late nights. But the counsel dismissed them with a casual wave of a manicured hand, not even glancing at the documents. "Mr. Miller, we appreciate your zeal," the DA had said, clearing his throat, his tone dripping with condescension. "But the evidence is quite clear." James clenched his jaw. The familiar burn of injustice rose within him, hardening his resolve. He'd known this wouldn't be easy, but the blatant disregard for due process was infuriating. It wasn't just about Noah anymore. It was about the system itself. Meanwhile, the school hallways, once a place of innocent chatter, had transformed into a gauntlet. Murals, usually so bright with cheerful colors, now seemed muted, sad, reflecting the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over Hazel. Whispers followed her like shadows, growing louder with each passing day, each one a tiny pinprick slowly bleeding away her spirit. She felt utterly alone. At lunch, the usual cluster of friends around her table had thinned. Averted gazes and hushed conversations replaced them, a stark visual of her new isolation. Hazel picked at her sandwich, the food tasting like ash in her mouth. Her vibrant imagination, usually teeming with fantastical creatures, now conjured only the scowling faces of the kids who called her father names. A heavy weight settled in her chest. From a nearby table, a group of older boys laughed, their voices too loud. "Terrorists, kid," one boy muttered, loud enough to carry. "Yeah, like father, like daughter." The words settled like ice. A chill crept down Hazel's spine. She instinctively hunched her shoulders, trying to disappear, wishing she could vanish into thin air. Parker, ever vigilant, watched his sister from across the cafeteria. His gaze, usually playful, was sharp now, protective. He saw the slump of her shoulders, the quick, furtive glances she cast around the room, shrinking into herself. His jaw tightened. A hot, familiar pressure built behind his eyes, the precursor to a rage he fought to suppress. He wanted to storm over, to shout, to make them stop. But he knew it would only make things worse, a frustrating impotence washing over him. A cold realization dawned. The weight of their father's case, of the town's sudden animosity, felt like a physical burden on his own young shoulders. It pressed down, heavy and relentless. He wondered, briefly, if he'd remembered to feed the cat this morning. The mundane thought was a strange, small anchor in the storm. After school, the walk home felt longer than usual. The familiar route, usually filled with their playful banter, was now a silent, somber procession. Hazel dragged her feet, the quiet between her and Parker heavier than any words they could have spoken. As they approached their mailbox, something small and colorful caught Hazel's eye, a tiny splash of unexpected brightness. Tucked carefully beside a wilting petunia was a flat, smooth river stone painted with a surprisingly detailed image of a soaring griffin with emerald eyes. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched Hazel's lips, a flicker of warmth in the deepening cold. It was a small, quiet moment of beauty, a brief reprieve in a world that felt increasingly ugly. The fragile peace shattered the very next day. The bright colors of the playground equipment seemed to mock the grim scene unfolding. During recess, a gaggle of boys, led by the perpetually sneering Kevin Davies, cornered Hazel near the swings. Their faces were twisted into cruel masks. "Hey, refugee lover," Kevin taunted, pushing Hazel's shoulder. A sneer plastered his face. Hazel stumbled, fear flashing in her eyes, a cold dread seizing her. Before she could even register the insult, Parker was there, a blur of motion, his fists clenched. "Leave her alone," Parker snarled, stepping between Hazel and the boys, his voice tight with anger. Kevin laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Look at the big man, protecting his little sister. Just like your daddy protects that terrorist." That was it. The word terrorist snapped something inside Parker. A furious, uncontrollable rage ignited. He lunged, a desperate, clumsy punch connecting with Kevin's jaw. The sound echoed sharply across the blacktop. The playground erupted in shouts and gasps as the two boys tumbled to the ground, a tangle of flailing limbs and furious grunts. Dust rose around them. Hazel screamed, a raw, terrified sound. Her small world crumbled. Later that evening, after the school principal's stern lecture and James's weary but understanding embrace, Parker sat in his room. A bruise bloomed on his cheek. The quiet of his room, usually a sanctuary, now felt heavy with the weight of his actions. He felt a strange mix, defiance warring with exhaustion, a stubborn pride battling the ache in his knuckles. He knew he'd get in trouble, probably suspended. But watching Hazel's face, seeing her fear, he couldn't have done anything else. Couldn't. The thought was a fierce, unshakable conviction. Downstairs, James paced the living room, the fight confirming his deepest fears. A cold dread gripped his heart, the accusation against Noah crushing them all, piece by agonizing piece. But despair was a luxury he couldn't afford. His mind was already racing, assembling a desperate late-night plan. Across the street, in the dim light of his living room, River watched the Miller house. From his shadowed window, he had a clear view, a silent sentinel. He noted the worried shadows behind the curtains, and the way the office light in the back of the house now burned late into the night, long after James's car had settled back into the driveway. Every detail, a tiny flicker of distress, was catalogued. The news reports of the trial, the vitriol on local forums, all of it stirred a familiar, unsettling hum beneath his skin. It was the restless energy of a protector on high alert, his PTSD symptoms subtly exacerbated by the escalating conflict. A primal instinct, long dormant, was awakening. He picked up a small, smooth stone from the windowsill, turning it over and over in his calloused fingers, his gaze distant. The world was growing bleaker for the children across the street, but a silent, watchful guardian was beginning to stir within him, ready to stand against the encroaching darkness. Chapter 4: Digital Footprints and Silent Guardians. The servers thrummed in James's makeshift home office, a steady, low pulse against the late-night quiet. He shifted, his chair protesting, and worked a crick from his neck. The air was thick with stale coffee and the quiet hum of focused intensity. He leaned closer, eyes narrowed at the glowing screen. A mosaic of social media feeds and financial logs spread before him. Ava Sterling's digital life laid bare. Beside him, his small team, 2 bright-eyed law students, worked diligently, fingers flying across keyboards, sifting through the digital detritus. "Anything new on the Sterling girls' public profiles?" James asked, his gaze still locked on a particularly convoluted financial record. It was a tangled thread, leading deep into Frank Sterling's shell corporations. Chloe, a sharp young woman on his team, cleared her throat. Her Instagram before the incident, James, was different. Lots of posts with friends, art school stuff. She paused, a frown deepening between her brows. After, it's all so controlled. The smiles are too wide, the poses too perfect, like she's trying to convince someone. And these comments. She gestured to a section of the screen. A series of generic, almost identical supportive messages from a handful of accounts scrolled beneath Ava's post-incident updates. James scrolled, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. A carefully constructed facade, he realized, not a young woman's genuine expression. "Check the timestamps on these supportive comments," he instructed, his voice low. "See if there's any pattern to when they appear, not just what they say." Someone was pulling strings, a digital puppeteer orchestrating a narrative. The town's social media, he recognized, had become a battlefield, truth twisted into weapons, prejudice a spreading contagion. He wondered, briefly, if he'd remembered to feed the cat before leaving the house. The thought was a momentary, absurd anchor in the digital storm. The feeling intensified, a cold prickle on his neck, the distinct sensation of being watched. Back at the house, the online vitriol had begun to seep into their physical world. Parker found it first, a crude, spray-painted message on their fence one morning, an ugly slur, aimed at Noah, but a knife meant for their entire family. James had scrubbed it off himself, his jaw aching, but the message lingered, an invisible stain on the wood, on their peace. That evening, as dusk deepened the sky to a bruised purple, painting the window pane a murky orange, he'd been installing security cameras. Each movement was precise, grim. A futile gesture, perhaps, but one he felt compelled to make. Hazel watched him from the kitchen window, her small face pressed against the cool glass. She didn't understand the specific words scrawled on the fence, But she understood the fear in her father's eyes. She saw the way his shoulders seemed permanently hunched. The world, once a brightly colored storybook, had gone muted, painted in shades of gray and sharp, jagged lines. Even Parker, usually aloof, had been quieter, sometimes just sitting on the floor near her, a silent, watchful presence. "Dad, what are those for?" she'd asked, pointing at the small, dark domes being affixed to the eaves. James paused, hammer in hand, and offered a weak smile. "Just making sure we're safe, Sweet Pea, like a guardian angel for our house." But Hazel knew guardian angels didn't come with blinking red lights. A ladybug crawled slowly across the window frame, its tiny legs a blur, oblivious to the shift in their world. As the silence stretched, her thoughts drifted, snagging on the quiet unease that had settled over their house like a shroud. Feeling the weight of their quiet house, Hazel often drifted to her bedroom window. She sought solace in the familiar street below, but her gaze was no longer fixed on her own yard. It was drawn, almost magnetically, to the house across the street, River's house. He was often outside, not doing much, tending a small, wild patch of garden near his porch. Sometimes just sitting, absolutely still, staring out at nothing. He wasn't the monster she'd imagined, not with the gentle way he handled a wilting flower. One afternoon, a small polished stone appeared on their mailbox. It was etched with a swirling pattern, reminiscent of an old shield. It wasn't the first time. The gifts had been coming more frequently, and they felt different now, more deliberate. She picked it up, the stone surprisingly warm in her palm, and glanced across the street. River was gone, but she felt a strange warmth, a flicker of something like protection. Meanwhile, the digital evidence was compelling, but James knew it wasn't enough. He needed to speak to Ava. He'd made repeated requests through legal channels, all summarily rejected by the Sterling legal team, an unyielding wall. He chafed at the constant obstruction. Finally, he decided on a more direct approach. It was a risk, a blatant disregard for protocol, but one he felt compelled to take. He found out where Ava was attending a private art class in a neighboring town, a place where Frank Sterling's omnipresent security might be less suffocating. He waited patiently outside the studio, a small, discreet building nestled between a coffee shop and a bookstore. A shiver traced his spine, despite the mild air, and he rubbed his tired eyes. When Ava finally emerged, her face pale and drawn, she looked nothing like the confident, almost defiant young woman portrayed in the news. She carried a large portfolio, clutching it tightly to her chest, knuckles white. "Get in, Ava, now!" Sterling's voice boomed, a sound like a slammed door, slicing through the afternoon air. Ava flinched, a visible tremor running through her. Her eyes, wide and pleading, flickered to James before she scrambled into the SUV. The door slammed shut. The vehicle sped away, leaving James standing on the curb. The image of her fear seared into his mind, a cold, hard knot. It wasn't Noah she was afraid of, it was Sterling. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Sterling wasn't just a powerful opponent, he was a cage around Ava, and her fear was palpable, a silent scream James couldn't ignore. The afternoon sun, once warm, now felt like a spotlight on his sudden, stark understanding. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. This was about protecting someone caught in Sterling's web, a truth far more dangerous than he'd anticipated. He had to fight, not just for Noah, but for Ava, even if she couldn't ask him to. The courtroom, tomorrow, would be his only weapon. Chapter 5: Pre-Trial Battle and Shifting Perceptions. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom hummed, casting a sickly yellowish glow on the faces gathered. It was a stark, almost clinical contrast to the bright Texas morning outside. James felt the familiar knot in his stomach tighten as Judge Albright's gavel cracked, calling the pre-trial hearing to order. The air felt heavy, dense, with an unspoken tension pressing down on everyone present. Frank Sterling's lead counsel, a man whose tailored suit seemed to fit a little too perfectly, rose to address the bench. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk played on his lips as he approached the podium with a confident stride. "Your Honor," the attorney began, his voice smooth and practiced, "the prosecution moves to suppress the defendant's alleged social media activity as it constitutes hearsay and is irrelevant to the direct assault charge." James gripped the edge of his table, knuckles white. His gaze, locked on the judge, felt like a physical weight. He knew this was just the first volley in a long, drawn-out battle. He'd anticipated this maneuver, a clear attempt to blind the jury to the underlying truth, to strip away context. For a fleeting second, he wondered if he'd remembered to switch off the coffee machine back at the office, a small, domestic concern in the face of this unfolding war. When it was his turn, James rose. His voice, though steady, carried the tension thrumming in the room. The scrape of his chair echoed slightly in the sudden quiet. "Your Honor, these posts are crucial. They paint a picture of the accuser's state of mind leading up to the incident, revealing a pattern of distress and potential manipulation directly relevant to the credibility of her testimony." He could feel the room's collective weight, the silent judgments, the subtle shifts in posture from the few spectators. A ripple of murmurs went through the gallery, quickly silenced by a stern look from the bailiff. This wasn't merely about legal technicalities, it was about fighting an ingrained current of prejudice, an undercurrent he felt pulling at the foundations of justice. The judge, known for leaning conservative, listened impassively. His expression remained unreadable, his steady gaze giving nothing away. After a brief, taut exchange, he made his ruling. "The court will allow the social media posts into evidence, but only those directly preceding the incident, and only for the purpose of establishing the accuser's state of mind, not as direct evidence of the assault itself." It was a partial win, a small crack in the formidable wall they faced. But James knew the fight was far from over. A flash of anger tightened his jaw, quickly replaced by a stubborn, weary resolve. The next few hours became a blur of legal skirmishes, motions and countermotions, each designed to erode Noah's defense. A beat of silence stretched, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Across town, Hazel sat by her bedroom window, a book lying forgotten in her lap. Her room, usually a quiet refuge, felt especially still, a stark contrast to the murmuring world outside. Her eyes were fixed on River's house across the street. It still held a certain mystery, a shadow of the unknown. Yet the apprehension that once colored her perception had begun to fade, replaced by a strange, burgeoning curiosity. She remembered the small polished stone, then the intricate bird's nest, and most recently, the pressed, vibrant autumn leaf that had appeared on their mailbox. These anonymous tokens had become a silent conversation, too deliberate to be random. A secret language, perhaps, a quiet acknowledgement. Today, River was out in his yard, not tending his wild garden as she'd sometimes seen him, but simply sitting. He occupied an old, weathered bench beneath a sprawling oak, the afternoon sun dappling through the leaves, creating shifting patterns on the ground around him. He seemed motionless, almost watchful, his gaze often drifting towards their house. Hazel felt a peculiar flutter in her chest. It wasn't fear, not anymore. It was something akin to recognition, a faint sense of being looked after. Taking a deep breath, she slowly, tentatively, raised her hand. Her fingers uncurled in a small, shy wave, a gesture she'd never dared before. Her heart pounded a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She noticed a tiny chip in the pale blue paint on her windowsill, a small imperfection against the white frame. At school, Parker walked through the crowded hallway. The usual jostle of bodies felt heavier today. The air buzzed with the low hum of student chatter and locker doors clanging shut. The whispers hadn't stopped, but they had changed. Some still carried a hateful sting, but others, he'd noticed, were tinged with a different kind of curiosity, even a grudging respect after his last confrontation. He spotted Mr. Henderson, his history teacher, leaning against a locker, watching him. Mr. Henderson, a quiet man, had always seemed fair-minded. Parker trusted his calm demeanor. "Parker," Mr. Henderson said, his voice low, "can I have a word?" Parker nodded, bracing himself. He half expected a lecture about fighting or about the latest rumors. Instead, Mr. Henderson simply offered a small, knowing smile. "I just wanted to say, what your father is doing, it takes immense bravery. And what you're doing, standing up for what's right, that takes bravery too." A surprising warmth spread through Parker. It wasn't a loud declaration, but a solid, undeniable anchor of support in a world that felt increasingly shaky. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the unexpected kindness. He offered a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement of the teacher's quiet strength. "Thanks, Mr. Henderson," Parker managed, a genuine smile finally touching his lips. He walked away feeling a renewed sense of resolve, a quiet strength settling deep in his bones. The weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. Later that afternoon, back in his office, the setting sun streamed through the blinds, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden air. The room was quiet, save for the distant city hum. James sat slumped in his chair, a mess of legal documents scattered across his desk. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up. The day's pre-trial hearings had been draining, a relentless assault on every facet of Noah's character and his case. He ran a hand through his hair, the cumulative weight pressing down on him. The community's animosity, the Sterling's power, the subtle but pervasive prejudice woven into the fabric of the justice system. It felt like an unyielding, towering wall. He thought of Hazel, of Parker, and the way their world had been upended. Was he truly doing the right thing, dragging them through this public ordeal? A small, nagging voice of doubt echoed in his mind, a cold whisper of regret. He closed his eyes, picturing Noah's quiet, earnest face, the fear in his eyes, the absolute trust in James's ability to help him. His moral compass, though battered by the day's battles, still pointed true. He had to keep fighting. Back at her window, Hazel watched River. Hazel's breath hitched. It was real. He had seen her. He had responded. A fragile, undeniable sense of connection bloomed in her chest. The monster across the street was not a monster at all, but a silent, watchful guardian, and now, perhaps, an unlikely friend. As evening fell, painting the sky in fiery hues, the quiet understanding between them gave way to the encroaching night. In James's office, the shadows deepened, turning the golden light to amber and then gray, reflecting the gravity of the task ahead. He picked up the first document, his fingers tracing the dense legal jargon. The path ahead was treacherous, he knew, filled with unseen traps and open hostility. Yet, looking at the names, the dates, the stark facts laid bare, he found a renewed surge of purpose. He wouldn't let the system or the Sterling's influence break Noah. He would fight for him, for his children, for the conviction that justice, however elusive, was worth every battle. He closed the file with a quiet thud. Tomorrow, the world would be watching. Tomorrow, the real trial would begin. And James, despite the weariness, would stand ready. Chapter 6. The Trial Begins. The courthouse steps seethed. A human tide of reporters, their cameras strobing, erupted like a sudden, disorienting squall. Flashbulbs popped, a constant, blinding stutter against the gray morning. Microphones lunged, jostling for purchase in the packed press scrum. James pushed through the throng, the collective gaze of public expectation a physical ache across his shoulders. Each step felt deliberate, a defiant act against the building roar of judgment. He caught a fleeting glimpse of himself in the polished glass doors. A man in a suit, the collar suddenly too tight, a stranger's face staring back. Inside, a different kind of pressure settled. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation. The hushed murmurs of the gallery a stark, almost reverent contrast to the chaos he'd just navigated. The courtroom itself was a grand, imposing space. It smelled of aged oak, polished brass, and something else, something sharp and faintly metallic, the tang of unspoken fears, perhaps. A profound quiet descended as the appointed hour neared. The judge's gavel struck, a single sharp report that instantly hushed the room, signaling the official start of proceedings. Frank Sterling occupied the prosecution's table, an air of righteous indignation clinging to him. His chin was held high, his gaze an unyielding, frigid stare fixed on Noah, who sat beside James, a study in pale stillness. James felt the familiar knot of dread cinch tighter in his gut. Sterling's lead attorney, a man whose voice could fill an auditorium, rose. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he boomed, "we will present evidence that paints a clear picture of a premeditated and brutal attack, an act of violence perpetrated by an outsider against one of our own." The words struck with visceral force. James watched a few jurors nod, their expressions hardening, their eyes already narrowed in judgment. The very atmosphere seemed to thicken, pressing in, stealing the breath from his lungs. Then it was James's turn. He rose, the sudden, profound silence of the courtroom amplifying his own heartbeat, and walked to the podium. The polished wood felt unexpectedly smooth beneath his fingertips, a small, grounding detail in the cavernous space. "My client, Noah Vance, is not a monster," James began, his voice calm, cutting through the lingering tension. "He is a young man caught in a tragic misunderstanding, a victim of circumstance and the rush to judgment. We will show you that the truth is far more complex than the prosecution would have you believe." He spoke of the messy, often misunderstood nature of people, not in abstract terms, but with a quiet conviction that fear, unchecked, could warp perception itself. The jury, a collection of local faces, met his gaze with impassive expressions, carefully neutral. Yet, a few shifted in their seats, one woman absently picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. James watched them, searching for any flicker of doubt, any subtle softening around their eyes. This was the beginning, he knew. There was no turning back, not now. He wondered, with a sudden mundane pang, if he'd have time for a proper dinner tonight, or if it would be another lukewarm coffee, forgotten on his desk. The first prosecution witness was called. He took the stand, a middle-aged man with a nervous twitch that pulled at the corner of his mouth, a faint coffee stain on his tie, a small detail of his everyday life now laid bare. "I saw him, Your Honor, clear as day," he began, gesturing emphatically, as if reliving the terror. He was just standing there, over her, with that look in his eyes. His story unspooled, each detail meticulously placed, designed to reinforce the initial reports of a brutal, unprovoked attack. James listened, his gaze unblinking, his mind already a whirlwind of analysis, sifting through every word, every pregnant pause, every subtle inconsistency. When it was his turn, James approached for cross-examination. his voice calm, yet carrying an undeniable edge of inquiry. "You stated you saw the defendant standing over her, sir. Can you confirm for the court if you witnessed him physically assault her, or did you merely observe his proximity to the victim after the incident occurred?" He probed gently at the witness's certainty, finding the soft spots, the implied assumptions. The man grew visibly flustered, his face reddening, his practiced composure fraying under James's precise, unyielding questioning. Across town, in the muted stillness of her living room, Hazel sat on the floor, her gaze riveted to the local news. The television's volume was barely a whisper. The room itself was dimly lit, painted in the flickering, cool blue glow of the screen. Images of the courtroom flashed by, a jumble of intense, unreadable faces, quick cuts of the courthouse exterior, then the interior, focusing on the stern, unyielding expressions of the legal teams. She saw her father, sharp and focused, then the grainy, blurry image of Noah, looking utterly lost. The reporter's voice, a steady, dispassionate drone, filled the quiet space. Local authorities are still piecing together the events of that night, but the prosecution has laid out a compelling case against Noah Vance, painting him as a dangerous individual. The narrative felt both impossibly distant and terrifyingly close, an invading force in her own home. Hazel clutched a worn teddy bear, its fur matted in places from years of comfort. She wished, with a child's fierce longing, that she could truly understand what was happening, wished the world hadn't suddenly gotten so complicated. Or perhaps, she mused with a wisdom beyond her years, it always had been, and she simply hadn't noticed until now. Another witness took the stand, their testimony bolstering the prosecution's case with what sounded like compelling detail. "I heard the screams," they insisted, "then I saw him running away, fast, into the woods." James methodically dissected their statements, his questions a surgeon's scalpel, exposing the biases and assumptions lurking beneath the surface. "Do you recall the precise time you heard these screams, and can you confirm the direction from which they originated relative to your position?" He felt a barely perceptible shift in the courtroom's atmosphere, a slight easing, like a breath held and slowly released. Yet the weight of the initial impression, the prosecution's narrative, remained heavy, almost crushing. Across the bench, the judge tapped his pen, a small rhythmic click that echoed in the brief silences. Miles away, River sat hunched in his darkened living room, the blinds drawn tight, heavy curtains blocking out the afternoon sun. The television's low hum was the only sound, a constant, droning companion. He watched the news coverage of the trial, unable to tear his eyes from the screen. The raw conflict, the harsh accusations, the public outcry, it all stirred a deep, unsettling current within him, a familiar echo of past traumas he'd fought so hard to bury. He saw James, a solitary figure straining against a powerful, unseen current, and then the flickering image of Noah, so vulnerable, so utterly alone. A tremor ran through River's hands as he clenched them, knuckles white, a cold sweat breaking out on his palms. The familiar ghosts of his own battles, long dormant, began to rise, swirling to the surface of his consciousness. He wondered, with a sudden anxious jolt, if he'd remembered to lock the back door. The day's most anticipated moment arrived with the calling of Ava Sterling. A sudden collective hush fell over the courtroom, the media section buzzing with a renewed predatory energy. Every eye in the room pivoted, fixing on the young woman as she approached, a palpable tension radiating from the witness stand. Ava's steps were hesitant, her face pale beneath a carefully applied, almost too perfect layer of makeup. Dressed in a simple, dark dress, she seemed impossibly fragile, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the polished wood of the stand cool and solid beneath her fingertips. She swore the oath, her voice a fragile whisper that barely carried beyond the first few rows. "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God." The prosecutor began, his tone gentle, almost paternal. "Miss Sterling, can you please recount for the court, in your own words, what happened on the night of the incident?" He guided her, with practiced ease, through her carefully rehearsed account of the alleged assault. Her answers were precise, almost too perfect in their recall. But James, watching intently, noticed a subtle tremor in her clasped hands, a fleeting flicker of fear in her eyes that, he suspected, had nothing to do with Noah and perhaps everything to do with her father. Watching the news footage, Hazel felt a strange, sympathetic pang in her chest as Ava spoke. Despite everything, despite the accusations against Noah, Hazel perceived a deeper sadness in Ava's eyes, a fear that seemed to transcend the alleged attack itself. It was a fear Hazel recognized, intimately, the same quiet, almost imperceptible distress she'd sometimes glimpsed in her own reflection, a hollow ache that made her stomach clench. James began his initial cross-examination of Ava, his questions gentle, almost sympathetic, yet meticulously crafted to find the weak points in her carefully constructed narrative. "Miss Sterling, you mentioned a look in Noah's eyes," he began, his voice soft. "Can you describe that look for the jury, and clarify if it was a look of aggression or perhaps something else entirely?" He wasn't trying to break her, not yet, but to peel back the layers, to uncover the truth hidden beneath the facade she presented. Ava's gaze darted, a swift, almost imperceptible movement, towards her father at the prosecution table, before snapping back to James. A beat of silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and a palpable tension. James waited, letting the quiet hang. Then he rephrased, his voice even softer. "Or was it, perhaps, a look of confusion, Miss Sterling?" He thought he saw her jaw clench, just for a second, a fleeting tightening that vanished as quickly as it appeared. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, the courtroom emptied slowly, a low hum of post-trial discussion replacing the earlier taut tension. James gathered his papers, his neck aching from the strain, his mind already racing ahead to the next day. So many questions still needed asking, so many truths still lay buried beneath layers of testimony and fear. The first day was over, a mere opening skirmish, but the real work, he knew, had only just begun. A janitor was already pushing a cart down the aisle, the clanking of bottles echoing softly, and the sharp, clean scent of disinfectant began to creep into the stale air, a sterile balm over the day's lingering unease. Back in his dark living room, River remained glued to the television. The screen, a lone beacon in the encroaching twilight, cast flickering images of the news anchor and long dancing shadows across the walls. The reporter concluded the day's summary. The first day of the highly anticipated trial of Noah Vance has concluded, with the prosecution presenting a series of witnesses, and the defense beginning its cross-examination. The trial is set to resume tomorrow morning. The screen immediately transitioned to a commercial break, but the reporter's words, the sounds of the trial, continued to echo in River's mind, exacerbating the gnawing anxiety of his PTSD. He stared blankly, seeing not just the trial, but the injustice, the fear, the manipulation that festered beneath the surface. A primal, protective instinct, long dormant, began to stir within him. It was no longer a silent urge, but a growing resolve to push back against the encroaching darkness. Tomorrow, he thought, things would have to change. Tomorrow, the whisper would demand to be heard. Chapter 7. The Unveiling. The air in the courtroom hung, thick and oppressive, pressing down on every soul. James felt it, a cold, familiar dread that had been his constant companion since taking Noah's case. But today it was laced with a sharp, almost frantic edge of purpose. His tongue felt like a dry wad of cotton. He adjusted his tie, the silk rough against his throat. His gaze swept over the jury, a scattered collection of faces ranging from stern disapproval to open hostility. He met the eye of a woman in a surprisingly cheerful floral scarf, who quickly looked away, a blush creeping up her neck. Across the aisle, Frank Sterling sat, impeccably tailored, his eyes fixed on James with an unnerving intensity. A gleam of something ugly, almost reptilian, resided in their depths. The morning had dragged, a tedious parade of expert witnesses for the prosecution, each meticulously constructing a narrative of Noah's guilt, laying brick after brick of circumstantial evidence. James had done his best to chip away at their testimonies, but the momentum felt irrevocably against them. The town's prejudice was a silent, powerful force, a palpable weight in the room. Now it was his turn. "The defense calls its next witness," James announced, his voice steady despite the faint tremor in his hands. A ripple of murmurs, like a disturbed current, ran through the gallery. He walked to the digital display, a large screen dominating the front of the courtroom, a silent promise. Miles away, Hazel sat hunched over the living room coffee table. A bowl of untouched cereal grew soggy beside her. The television screen flickered with the live broadcast from the courthouse, her father, a small, resolute figure in the distant frame. Her stomach churned with a nervous flutter, a feeling she'd grown accustomed to. But today, it felt sharper, a premonition, or perhaps just the stale air in the house. She wondered if the neighbor's cat, Mittens, had finally caught that squirrel raiding the bird feeder. Parker was upstairs, pretending to study, but she knew he was listening too. The house held its breath. Back in court, James began to speak, his words carefully chosen, each syllable a deliberate step in the foundation he was building. He introduced the concept of digital forensics, explaining how data could tell a story people might try to hide, how even the unseen could be brought to light. Sterling's attorney, Mr. Thompson, immediately rose to object, his voice booming, a performance of practiced outrage. "Your Honor, this is pure speculation, hearsay at best, and a blatant attempt to—" James cut him off, his voice a little too calm, a quiet razor's edge. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this evidence is irrefutable and directly pertains to the events of that night, as well as the credibility of the prosecution's star witness." The judge, a man known for his cautious temperament, leaned forward, his expression unreadable. The air thickened. After a tense pause that stretched into an eternity, he overruled the objection. Then, the moment arrived. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, a sharp intake of breath. James nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the shift in the room's energy, and turned to the screen. He began to navigate through a series of files, each click echoing loudly in the sudden, absolute quiet. Encrypted messages appeared, then a timeline of communications between Ava and an unknown contact. Finally, a recovered file. "This, Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is a recording recovered from Ava Sterling's personal device," James announced, his voice cutting through the hush. "It was, we believe, inadvertently captured by her own device, a function she may not have been aware was active." A beat later, the full weight of the words settled. On the screen, a dark, grainy video began to play. The audio, initially muffled, slowly became clearer, revealing the distinct sound of a man's voice, raised in anger. It was Frank Sterling. The video showed quick, jarring movements, a hand striking out, and then Ava Sterling's terrified whimper. The footage was brief, a mere handful of seconds, but devastatingly clear. "You will tell them exactly what I told you to say, Ava," Sterling's voice snarled from the speakers, "or you will regret it for the rest of your pathetic life. That refugee is going down, and you, my dear, are going to make sure of it." The recording ended with Ava's choked sob. The quiet that followed was heavy with implication, a stunned stillness that fell over the courtroom, deeper than any silence before. Then a ripple, a wave of gasps and murmurs grew into an audible roar. Frank Sterling surged to his feet, his face a mask of raw, ugly fury. His chair scraped loudly across the polished floor. "This is a fabrication, a lie!" he bellowed, pointing a trembling finger at James. "He planted this! It's a setup!" Ava Sterling, who had been sitting rigidly in the gallery, her face pale as parchment, suddenly collapsed. Her body racked with shuddering sobs. Her carefully constructed composure shattered, spilling across the floor. Raw fear bloomed across her face, stark and undeniable. Bailiffs moved quickly to restrain Sterling, who was now shouting obscenities, his carefully cultivated image dissolving into that of a violent, desperate man. The thin veneer of respectability had been stripped away. The judge hammered his gavel repeatedly, a frantic rhythm against the rising din. His voice was a strained roar over the chaos. "Order! Order in this court!" Hazel watched it all unfold on the television, her small hands pressed over her mouth. Her gaze swept across the newly illuminated details. The cereal bowl was forgotten, a forgotten relic of a simpler morning. Her father's face, usually so composed, held a trace of grim triumph, but also a profound sadness. The monster wasn't the quiet man across the street, nor the gentle refugee. It was Frank Sterling, the powerful man who had commanded so much fear. Her world, once so clearly divided into good and bad, shattered. Not into neat pieces, but into a painful, nuanced blur. A bitter taste filled her mouth, like she'd just bitten into something rotten. The acrid flavor of injustice and manipulation. This new understanding shifted everything. The courtroom slowly regained a semblance of order, Sterling having been forcibly removed, his shouts fading down the hallway. Ava was being attended to by paramedics, her cries echoing faintly from the hallway. James knew the media scrum outside the courthouse would be in a frenzy, the narrative irrevocably shifted. But he also knew this wasn't over. A cold, heavy certainty settled deep within him. Sterling's rage, now publicly exposed, would only fester and grow. The immediate victory felt hollow, a temporary reprieve. The adrenaline that had fueled him through the chaos began to recede, leaving behind a profound exhaustion, a dull ache behind his eyes. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the scent of stale coffee clinging to his fingers. The fight for Noah, he realized, was far from over. It had merely shifted, from the public spectacle of the courtroom to the agonizing, silent wait for what came next. He needed to find Parker, Maria, and Hazel. They would be waiting, just as he was. The real battle, he knew, was only just beginning. Chapter 8: The Price of Prejudice. The fluorescent lights of the courthouse hallway pulsed with a low, persistent hum, a sound that grated on James's nerves. His bladder ached, a dull, insistent throb that seemed to magnify the silence in their small, anxious circle. Each tick of the oversized wall clock landed like a dull blow against his temple, echoing the frantic rhythm of his own heart. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the scent of stale coffee clinging to his fingers. For a fleeting second, he wondered if he'd remembered to feed the cat that morning. Then the thought vanished, swallowed by the heavy, expectant air. Across from him, his junior associate, Maria, shifted uncomfortably. She rubbed at her temples with a thumb and forefinger, her gaze locked on the double doors of the deliberation room. Beside Parker, on a polished wooden bench, Hazel sat with her small hands clasped tight in her lap, eyes wide and unblinking. She hadn't touched the half-eaten granola bar. Her usual cheerful chatter had been replaced by a stillness that made James's stomach clench, a quiet resignation like a doll left on a shelf. Parker, ever the protector, had his arm loosely around her shoulders, though his own jaw was clenched, a muscle twitching beneath his skin. Outside, the town hummed with a different kind of anticipation. News vans idled along the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like giant, hungry ears, straining for any whisper of news. Reporters clustered in low-voiced conversations, their glances flicking towards the courthouse steps, waiting for the inevitable moment. James had caught fragments of their broadcasts earlier, the same tired rhetoric, the same prejudiced assumptions repackaged for the evening news. Every time the deliberation room door creaked, a jolt of adrenaline shot through him, quickly deflated by the sight of only a bailiff. He found himself staring at a water stain on the ceiling tile, shaped vaguely like a forgotten continent. He thought of Noah, locked away, his fate hanging precariously on the biases of 12 strangers. Hours bled into days. The initial media frenzy slowly died down, replaced by a weary vigil. James spent his nights pacing his living room, the glow of the television screen casting long shadows that stretched and shrank with his movements. He watched the talking heads dissecting every detail of the trial, every piece of evidence he'd so painstakingly presented. He knew the truth. He had proven Sterling's manipulation, Ava's coercion, the sheer, undeniable innocence of Noah. Yet a cold dread had begun to settle deep in his bones. He pictured the jury, then Noah, and a specific, unsettling image flashed through his mind. A locked door, a dark wall, that facts alone might not open against the deep-seated prejudice of their town. He recalled a hushed conversation he'd overheard between Sterling's lawyer and a reporter in the hallway, a smug confidence in the lawyer's tone that sent a shiver down his spine, a premonition of defeat. Across the street, River sat in the dim light of his living room, the low murmur of the news anchor a constant companion. He hadn't left the house since the trial began, the outside world a constant, jarring reminder of everything he'd lost. But the images on the screen, the repeated accusations against Noah, the blatant disregard for James's painstakingly presented evidence, stoked a different kind of heat within him. His hands, calloused and scarred, clenched and unclenched, a silent rhythm of rising anger. He saw the world in stark terms, right and wrong, predator and prey. What was unfolding felt sickeningly wrong. The memory of his own past, of injustices witnessed and suffered, churned in his gut, a metallic taste like old pennies in his mouth. He watched the Sterling family on screen, Frank Sterling's grim, unyielding face, and a dangerous glint entered River's usually haunted eyes. Then a sudden, sharp ring cut through the courthouse's heavy quiet. James's heart hammered against his ribs. It was the clerk, her voice tight with official urgency. The jury had reached a verdict. A wave of nausea washed over him, immediately followed by a flicker of desperate, irrational hope. He looked at Hazel, her face pale, her eyes wide with a question he couldn't answer. Parker squeezed her hand, his gaze meeting his father's, a silent, desperate plea for strength. The courtroom, once a battleground of words, was now hushed, the silence thick and heavy. Every seat was filled, the air dense with anticipation, fear, and a palpable tension, an undercurrent of animosity that prickled James's skin. Frank Sterling sat in the front row, a thin, satisfied smirk playing on his lips, flanked by his legal team. Noah, dressed in a simple, ill-fitting suit, stood beside James. His shoulders were slumped, his gaze fixed on the judge. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable masks. James searched their eyes, desperate for a hint, a flicker of compassion, but found only blankness, an impenetrable wall. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The judge's voice, a little too loud, scraped across the quiet. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. The clerk took the envelope. Her movements were slow, deliberate, each second stretching into an eternity. She unfolded the paper. "In the matter of the State versus Noah Al-Hamad, on the charge of assault in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant—" The world seemed to hold its breath. James felt his own breath catch, his chest tightening in a vice grip. This was it. Everything hinged on this one word. Guilty. The single word echoed in the sudden, sharp silence. Then the courtroom erupted. A wave of muted cheers rippled through Sterling's supporters, quickly stifled by the judge's sharp rap of the gavel. The word hit James like a physical blow, knocking the wind from his lungs. His vision blurred, the courtroom spinning around him. He gripped the table, knuckles white, trying to steady himself, to comprehend the incomprehensible. Beside him, Noah swayed, his face utterly devoid of emotion, a mask of desolate resignation. All the evidence, all the truth, all the fight had been for nothing. The prejudice had won. The aftermath was a blur of bureaucratic efficiency and stark finality. Noah was immediately taken into custody, the process of his deportation already set in motion. James managed a brief, heartbreaking farewell, his voice thick with unshed tears and a heavy sense of failure. Noah simply nodded, a faint, weary smile on his lips. His eyes, though, held a flicker of deep sorrow, and James knew, with a fresh wave of pain, that Noah was somehow apologizing. James watched him go, his idealism, once a bright flame, now a smoldering ruin. Back home, the silence in their house was heavier than any noise. Hazel sat at the kitchen table, pushing her dinner around with a fork, her face set in a quiet, bitter understanding. She hadn't cried, but her eyes held a depth of sadness that tore at James's heart. He tried to offer comfort, to explain, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain this failure, a justice system that had so utterly failed them all? Later that evening, as James stood on his porch, the cool night air doing little to soothe his frayed nerves, he saw Frank Sterling pull up across the street. Sterling stepped out of his luxury car, his gaze sweeping over James's house before settling on him. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face, lingering like a predator's. "A shame about your client, James," Sterling called out, his voice smooth, dripping with false sympathy. "Some battles, even the most righteous, are just unwinnable." He paused, a beat too long, letting the words hang in the still air, heavy with unspoken malice. Then, almost as an afterthought, his eyes flickered towards the house, a subtle, terrifying gesture. "Especially when you make powerful enemies. There's always a price for humiliation." The implication was no longer a veiled threat, but a cold, venomous promise of retribution aimed not just at James, but at the fragile peace he had built. A new, more primal fear coiled in James's gut, a sickening dread that tightened around the images of Hazel sketching in the living room, Parker lost in his music. Sterling's victory was not enough. He wanted to make them pay, to shatter everything James held dear. Across the street, in the shadows of his living room, River watched the exchange. He saw Sterling's smug face, heard the chilling inflection of his threats, and the casual flick of his gaze towards the house. The news of the verdict had already hit him like a physical blow, but this personal targeting ignited a slow-burning fury he hadn't felt in years. The injustice, the blatant abuse of power, the silent suffering of the innocent, it all coalesced into a singular, undeniable urge to do something, to protect. His military training, long buried under layers of trauma and reclusion, began to stir, a sharp, familiar edge returning to his mind. He moved away from the window, his gaze settling on a dusty, locked cabinet in the corner of the room. The quiet guardian was about to become a shield, a weapon, something far more dangerous. Chapter 9. Tragedy and Shadowplay. The phone shrieked, a sharp, insistent sound that shattered the quiet evening. James answered, his voice a weary sigh, but the words that followed struck him like a physical blow. Noah was dead. He stood for a long moment, receiver gripped tight, the world outside the window dissolving into blurry streaks of streetlight. A hairline crack spiderwebbed across the ceiling, a detail he'd never noticed before, utterly inconsequential, yet it captured his gaze. When he finally hung up, the silence that fell was denser than before, heavy with unspoken grief, pressing in from the quiet corners of the house. He found Hazel in the living room, hunched over her sketchbook, sketching intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. She chewed absently on the end of her pencil, leaving faint teeth marks. Parker was sprawled on the couch, headphones on, humming tunelessly to whatever was blasting in his ears, oblivious to the world. James knelt, his hand gently touching Hazel's shoulder. The news spilled out, broken and raw, catching in his throat. Hazel's eyes, usually so bright with imagination, dimmed. Not just reflecting understanding, but a sudden, visceral knowledge of a world far crueler than any of her stories. Parker tore off his headphones, a sharp, disbelieving intake of breath escaping him, a choked sound that was almost a sob. The weight of Noah's death, so far away in a desolate refugee camp, settled upon them like a shroud. A bitter, profound truth about a justice system that had abandoned them. The days that followed blurred into a monochrome landscape of hushed tones, each one colder than the last. James, though outwardly composed, moved with a new, brittle edge. His jaw was perpetually tight, a permanent stiffness in his neck. His once proud firm, a place he'd built on principle, began to feel Frank Sterling's vengeance tightening its grip. Anonymous complaints mounted, clients mysteriously pulled out. The very foundations of his livelihood started to crack beneath him. He spent late nights on the phone, his voice strained, trying to shore up what felt like a crumbling edifice. Meanwhile, Hazel and Parker felt the shift in their own lives, a deepening disquiet that settled in their bones. It started subtly, a series of unsettling incidents that felt too deliberate to be accidental. At school, Hazel's bike chain inexplicably broke mid-ride, sending her sprawling onto the asphalt. It was a close call with a passing car that left a nasty scrape on her knee and a persistent tremor in her hands. Parker found his locker vandalized with xenophobic slurs, a raw, ugly reminder of the hatred simmering beneath the town's surface. He clenched his fists, a metallic tang on his tongue, but said nothing. He tried to shield Hazel from the worst of it, though she saw the sudden apprehension in his eyes. One evening, as James was leaving for a late meeting, he noticed a faint, acrid smell near his car. He paused, sniffing the air, wondering if the neighbor was burning something again. A quick inspection revealed a loose fuel line, almost imperceptible, expertly tampered with. A chill settled deep in his stomach. He had no proof, but the timing was too perfect, the malice too clear. Across the street, in the shadowed quiet of his own home, River watched. He saw the children's withdrawn faces, the tension in James's shoulders. He'd seen the figure lurking near James's car earlier, a shadow melting into the dusk. He had made his own silent adjustments, a small, almost invisible piece of wire, a strategically placed stone. just enough to draw attention to the sabotage without revealing his hand. River had always been a ghost, a presence barely registered. But the injustice, the blatant cruelty, was stirring something deep within him, an instinct of protection that felt ancient and absolute. Hazel, walking home from school a few days later, felt a chill crawl up her spine. The air was unusually still, heavy and humid, promising a storm, but the street was empty, silent. As she rounded the corner to her house, she saw a car, dark and unfamiliar, parked a few houses down. A man sat inside, his face obscured by the tinted window, but she felt his gaze, heavy and cold, like a physical weight. Her pulse quickened, a frantic drum against her ribs. She quickened her pace, eyes darting instinctively to River's house. She saw him then, a subtle shift in his window, a figure standing back in the shadows. It wasn't the first time. The polished stones, the perfectly arranged pine cones that appeared on their porch, the way the strange man who'd been watching their house last week had suddenly bolted when River's porch light had inexplicably flared on. The pieces clicked into place, terrifying yet deeply comforting. She whispered his name, a silent plea, a sudden, undeniable understanding. The monster across the street was their most steadfast guardian. But even a guardian couldn't be everywhere, couldn't stop everything. The Shadowplay intensified. Parker came home one afternoon with a bruised jaw, throbbing under his touch after a nasty encounter with older kids near the park. His grim resolve masked raw apprehension, mirroring Hazel's own. He refused to talk about it. James, too, noticed the escalating threats, his security cameras capturing fleeting glimpses of figures near their property, too quick, too obscured to identify, but undeniably there. One afternoon, as Hazel and Parker walked home from the bus stop, the air was thick with humid stillness, heavy with the scent of impending rain. They were laughing, a rare moment of lightness, when a black SUV, the same one Hazel had glimpsed before, roared and skidded to a stop beside them. Two hulking, grim-faced men spilled from the vehicle, instantly blocking their path. A profound terror, far more potent than any fear of thunder, seized Hazel. Parker instinctively yanked her behind him, his small body rigid, a fragile shield. The men advanced, their unnerving smiles stretching thin, and the world compressed into the small, dangerous space between them and the bus stop. Chapter 10. The True Monsters and Unlikely Heroes. The men's smiles stretched, thin and chilling, devouring the last vestiges of light from the street as they advanced. Parker, a boy too slight for the role, instinctively positioned himself as a shield, Hazel pressed close behind him. His small frame was rigid, knees knocking a frantic rhythm he couldn't control. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of exhaust and something sharp, metallic, like blood. Or perhaps that was only Hazel's own fear, a taste on her tongue. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the world didn't disappear. It only sharpened, the crunch of gravel under the men's boots thudding a relentless drum against her ribs. One of the men, a hulking figure with a shaved head, took another step forward. His voice, a low rumble, promised pain, a sound that seemed to vibrate deep in Hazel's bones. Parker instinctively tightened his grip on her hand, his gaze locked on the advancing figures. The other man, leaner and quicker, began to circle, and Hazel's heart sank. He was blocking the path to their front door. Her breath hitched, a silent sob catching in her throat. Trapped, truly trapped. A sudden sharp crack from the overgrown woods across the street made them all freeze. A twig snapped under an unseen foot. The thugs glanced towards the sound, their predatory focus momentarily fractured. Parker tried to use the distraction, pulling Hazel, urging her to run, but they were too slow, too small. The hulking man laughed, a harsh, grating sound that extinguished any flicker of hope. He reached out, not to grab, but to push Parker aside with an effortless shove. Parker stumbled, hitting the ground, the gravel digging into his knee. He scrambled back up, eyes blazing with a fierce, futile anger. Before anyone could react, a subtle shift in the shadows across the street caught her eye. The second man, no longer circling, moved swiftly towards Hazel. She let out a small, terrified cry, her hands flying up in a futile defense. The air crackled with a sudden, unexpected energy, a prickle that made the hairs on her arms stand up. From the shadowed porch of the house across the street, a figure emerged, slow and deliberate, a stark silhouette against the fading light. Hazel noticed, with a strange, almost irrelevant clarity, that the porch light remained stubbornly dark. The thugs, still focused on their immediate prey, didn't immediately notice. The leaner man grabbed Hazel's arm, his fingers digging in like talons. A choked, desperate cry tore from Parker's throat as he lunged, a tiny, furious blur. He landed a clumsy punch, surprisingly effective, startling the assailant and making him release Hazel momentarily. Hazel scrambled away, tripping over her own feet, her eyes wide with terror, but now also a flicker of defiance. A beat of silence stretched, thick with the smell of fear and the unspoken question hanging in the humid air. Who is this man? River stepped off his porch, his movements fluid. His form no longer hunched, but straightened, every line of him suddenly taut and ready. He didn't run, he didn't shout, he simply moved, a silent, gathering storm. The first assailant, still recovering from Parker's unexpected blow, turned, his eyes narrowing as he finally registered the new presence. River offered no words, but his gaze, steady and cold, seemed to deflate the man, making him shrink a fraction. The hulking man, seeing his partner's sudden hesitation, finally noticed River. He scoffed, trying to regain control of the crumbling situation. "Old man, this ain't your business," he growled, taking a challenging step towards River. River met him head-on, his movements economical, precise, a slight grunt escaping him as he absorbed the initial impact. A swift, unexpected block, a pivot, and the hulking figure found himself off balance, his arm twisted at an awkward angle. There was no anger in River's eyes, no heat, just a chilling, absolute focus. The second assailant, seeing his partner struggling, abandoned Hazel and Parker, drawing a small, glinting object from his pocket. "He's got a knife!" Parker screamed, pulling Hazel further back towards their fence, away from the escalating confrontation. River didn't flinch. As the man lunged, the blade flashing under the streetlights, River moved with astonishing speed, a swift, fluid blur. A twist, a lock, and the knife clattered harmlessly to the ground, the assailant crying out as his wrist was expertly immobilized. The hulking man, now thoroughly disoriented, tried to swing wildly. But River was already ahead of him, anticipating every move. A precise strike to a pressure point, a quick, controlled fall, and the larger man was on the ground, winded and momentarily incapacitated, but unharmed. The second assailant, his arm still twisted painfully, was released with a shove, sending him sprawling next to his partner. River stood over them, not with aggression, but with an unwavering stillness that felt heavier than any overt threat. The men, humbled and clearly outmatched, exchanged panicked glances. "Get out." River's voice was a low growl, rough with disuse, but carrying an undeniable authority that resonated through the suddenly quiet street. There was no need for further persuasion. Scrambling to their feet, the two men stumbled backwards, fear replacing their earlier bravado, and then broke into a ragged run, vanishing into the deeper shadows. River remained standing, a silent sentinel, watching until their retreating figures were long gone. A stray dog barked once, far down the street, and then fell silent, as if acknowledging the new peace. Hazel's gaze instinctively swept the surrounding desolation. The sudden silence that descended felt like a physical weight, pressing down, broken only by her own ragged breathing and Parker's quiet whimpers. Then, the distant wail of sirens pierced the night, growing steadily louder. River finally turned, his gaze sweeping over the children, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Hazel, still trembling, slowly raised her head. She looked at River, no longer seeing the monster from her childhood stories, but just River. And in that moment, he was enough. Before the police cruisers skidded to a halt, flooding the street with strobing blue and red lights, Hazel took a tentative step towards River. She didn't know what to say, but a warmth, like a sudden sunbeam, spread through her chest. The officers, crisp in their uniforms, began their questioning. Their voices, calm and official, seemed to push the terror of moments ago into a distant, unreal place, softening the edges of recent horror. Sterling's influence was palpable, even in their carefully neutral tones, their questions subtly guiding the narrative away from a direct assault. Just as the officers finished their initial assessment, James's car skidded to a halt, his face pale with terror. He had received Parker's frantic, whispered call and driven like a madman. Seeing his children safe, he rushed to them, pulling them into a fierce embrace. He looked up, his eyes meeting River's across the short distance, a silent acknowledgement passing between the two men. James opened his mouth, a choked "thank you" forming, but an officer's voice cut in, asking for his statement. There was no need for words. James understood. River had been watching over them. Later, after the police had left, their report vague and dismissive of the true danger, the house felt strangely quiet. Hazel sat on her porch swing, Parker beside her, both still shaken but beginning to process the night's events. She wondered if she'd ever be able to sleep without the streetlights on again. She looked across the street at River's house, now dark but no longer menacing. The small, anonymous gifts, the polished stone, the perfectly arranged nest, the handmade charm, suddenly clicked into place, making a strange, unsettling kind of sense she had been too afraid to understand. James joined them, wrapping an arm around each of his children. His voice was hoarse, filled with a mixture of grief for Noah and profound relief for his family. The world had shown them its ugliest side, its injustice and its cruelty, but it had also revealed unexpected courage and the quiet strength of an unlikely hero. Hazel leaned her head against her father's shoulder, her innocence irrevocably lost, replaced by a deeper, more complicated understanding of the world. True monsters weren't always obvious, and heroes didn't always wear capes. Sometimes they lived across the street, battling their own silent wars. She thought of River, and the blur of his hands, so fast, so sure. The next morning, Hazel found River sitting on his porch, a rare sight. She walked across the street, a small, tentative smile on her face. River looked up. His eyes, though still guarded, held a softness she hadn't seen before. He didn't speak, just offered a faint, almost imperceptible nod. Hazel sat on the edge of his porch, not afraid, just quietly present. The air was cool, a faint breeze rustling the leaves in the ancient oak tree. She noticed a spider web, intricate and delicate, strung between two porch posts, shimmering with dew. The silence stretched, not heavy with fear, but with something new, something like a fragile understanding. Noah's absence was still a raw ache, a reminder of how broken the world could be. But here, on this porch, with River, a different kind of truth settled in. Maybe, just maybe, even in a flawed world, there was still a way to live, to protect, to find a quiet kind of peace. She didn't know how, not yet, but she knew it started here, with a simple nod and the morning sun warming her face. Epilogue. 2 years later, the Texas summer still hummed, but it sounded different now. Hazel stood on the front porch, no longer a child chasing invisible dragons, but a girl on the cusp of something else, 13 years old, red hair pulled back in a ponytail instead of pigtails. The street looked the same, sun-baked asphalt, towering oaks, the faint chorus of cicadas, but everything had changed. Across the street, River's house no longer seemed dark or foreboding. Fresh paint covered the weathered siding, a soft sage green that Hazel had helped him choose last spring. The wild tangle of weeds had given way to a modest but tended garden, where tomatoes and wildflowers grew side by side. River sat on his porch now, a mug of coffee in his weathered hands, and when he caught her eye, he offered a small nod. Not quite a smile, but close enough. She walked across the street without hesitation, her sneakers, no longer bright red but scuffed blue, slapping against the pavement. The mailbox where those mysterious stones had once appeared now held a small wooden plaque River had carved, Miller and Cross, marking the invisible boundary where two families had become something more. "Morning, Hazel," River said, his voice still quiet but no longer quite so guarded. The shadows that once clung to him hadn't disappeared entirely, they never would, but they'd softened, like morning fog burning away in sunlight. "Morning." She settled onto the porch steps beside him, a routine they'd fallen into over the past 2 years. Some mornings they talked, most mornings they just sat, a comfortable silence between them. Today felt like a talking day. "Dad's at the courthouse again," she said, pulling her knees to her chest. "The civil suit against Sterling." River nodded. The criminal trial had ended 18 months ago, Frank Sterling convicted of conspiracy, evidence tampering, and witness intimidation. But the civil case, seeking justice for Noah's family still in Syria, dragged on. James fought every day, stubborn and unrelenting, though the weariness in his eyes never quite faded. "He'll win," River said simply, with the quiet certainty of someone who'd learned to recognize a fighter when he saw one. Hazel hoped he was right. She thought of Noah often. His frightened face in the courtroom photos, the hollow ache when the news of his death reached them. He'd died in detention before the verdict was read, before Sterling's recorded confession played in that silent courtroom, before Ava finally broke free of her father's control and told the truth. The injustice of it still burned, a small, hot coal lodged permanently in Hazel's chest. "Have you heard from Ava?" River asked, as if reading her thoughts. "She sent a postcard last week, from California." Ava had left Maycomb. No one blamed her. She was studying art at a small college, painting her way through trauma, trying to build a life unshackled from her father's legacy. Her postcards came sporadically, filled with awkward apologies and tentative hopes. Hazel always wrote back. Forgiveness, she'd learned, was a choice you made every day. Parker appeared in their doorway across the street, now 15 and startlingly tall, his basketball under one arm. The bruises and anger that once defined him had mellowed into something steadier. He'd become the kind of kid who defended the new students, who noticed when someone sat alone at lunch. That night 2 years ago, when River had pulled him and Hazel from Sterling's hired thug, when everything had come crashing down, had marked him permanently. "You comin', Haze?" Parker called. "Mom made pancakes." "In a minute," she called back. River took a sip of his coffee, his gaze distant. "You know," he said slowly, "I used to think the world was divided into monsters and heroes. Combat does that to you, makes everything binary." He paused, turning the mug in his calloused hands. "But your family taught me something different." "Taught me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway." Hazel felt a lump form in her throat. She thought of her father, exhausted and resolute, fighting battles most people avoided. She thought of her mother, Sarah, who'd stood beside him even when the town turned ugly, who'd scrubbed hate speech off their fence without complaint. She thought of Parker, who'd thrown punches to protect her, and River, who'd emerged from his isolation to save them all. "Do you think the town's really changed?" Hazel asked quietly. River considered this. "Some have, some haven't. Mrs. Henderson down the street still crosses to the other side when she sees me. But the Martinez family invited me to their barbecue last month." He shrugged. "Change comes slow, kid, like watching paint dry, but it comes." A breeze rustled through the oak trees, carrying the scent of River's tomatoes and Sarah's pancakes. Somewhere down the street, children laughed, the sound careless and bright. The world kept turning, indifferent to their small battles and smaller victories. Hazel stood, brushing dust from her shorts. "Thanks, River." "For what?" "For the stones, for watching over us, for being brave when you didn't have to be." River's expression softened, something almost like peace settling over his weathered features. "We all need looking after sometimes, Hazel, even monsters." She smiled, a real smile, the kind she hadn't managed for months after Noah died. "You were never a monster." "Neither was he," River said quietly, and Hazel knew he meant Noah. "That's the thing about monsters. Most of them are just people we haven't bothered to see yet." She crossed back to her house, where her family waited, imperfect, exhausted, but unbroken. The fight wasn't over. It never really was. But as she climbed the porch steps, she glanced back at River, who'd returned to his coffee and his quiet morning. The monster across the street had become something far more important: a friend, a guardian, a reminder that human beings were capable of both terrible cruelty and extraordinary grace. And in the end, Hazel thought, maybe that was the truest thing she'd learned: that the world wasn't divided into heroes and monsters, but filled with people trying their best to do right by each other, one difficult choice at a time. Inside, Parker had already claimed half the pancakes. Sarah poured orange juice. James, tie loosened, looked up from his case files and smiled, a weary but genuine expression. "Come on, sweet pea," he said. "Breakfast is getting cold." Hazel slid into her seat, surrounded by the people she loved, carrying Noah's memory like a candle flame cupped carefully in her palm. The summer hummed on, golden and thick with possibility, and for the first time in 2 long years, she felt something very much like hope.